Hi, my name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week, I will pick one thing and dive into it for about 10 to 15 minutes, and at the end, hopefully, we have a better idea of how it happened. This week, dollar stores. How did that happen? For what feels like a lifetime, there have been stores that advertise their goods are only $1. They come in all shapes and sizes, with some being within the vicinity of $1 and others being closer to a penny. As a kid who grew up in Virginia Beach in the 90s, dollar stores were ubiquitous. This is because Hampton Roads is the home to the headquarters of Dollar Tree, or Only $1, as it was known until 1993. Our story starts in the 19th century with the creation of five and dime stores. Woolsworth is a name that a lot of older generations will recognize, but it is known for much more than having once been home to the world's tallest building, which was surpassed by Chicago's Chrysler Building in 1930. Woolsworth began as a five and dime store in Utica, New York in 1879, but due to inflation in the early 20th century, they were forced to raise their prices, starting with 20 cents and moving on from there, and eventually becoming one of the leading discount department stores, paving the way for names such as Target and Walmart, but that's an entirely other episode. They laid the groundwork for what will become a multi-billion dollar business model, cheaply made goods that were imported to America and sold for profit. In those days, the imports were coming from Europe, and some of the stories surrounding the struggle were astonishing. An article from the Saturday Evening Post quoted the owner himself, Frank Woolworth, while on a buying trip to Germany, as saying, "The streets are filled with women with baskets on their backs, filled with dolls and toys." Essentially, the women in these small village towns in Germany would make the dolls at their homes and then walk miles to the city and sell them for maybe 3 cents to the Woolworths, only for the Woolworths to turn around and sell them for 10 cents, or as we said before, 20 cents and maybe even more. What makes it worse is that when the women in these towns, well, excuse me, what makes it worse is that the women in these towns were forced to buy the supplies themselves, which meant after clearing their overhead, they got to keep maybe at 1 cent for every dollar they made. Excuse me, not every doll they made. He goes on to say, "We saw a poor little girl." He's still speaking about this trip in Germany. "We saw a poor little girl that could not have been over 4 years old, with a basket strapped on her back, larger than herself, and Mr. Hunt asked her where she lived, and she told us, 'A place about 5 miles from here,' and she came alone. We gave her some money, and she looked at it as if she had never seen it before." These are words from the man himself, Frank Woolworth, who was profiting off their backs, quite literally. It is from these roots that sprung the modern dollar store. Stores like Dollar Tree and Dollar General owe their spot in society to men like Frank Woolworth. As said earlier, the inflation is what caused the five and dime store to fall out of favor, leading the way for stores like Dollar General to take hold. Dollar General is interesting because of the three modern dollar stores that I researched for this episode. It is the only one that actually sold products for $1 when they began. I mean, that's a little bit, it's not quite true. You'll see Family Dollar sold their products for $1 as well, but for very briefly when they began, whereas Dollar General, that was the model. Very similar to Dollar Tree's model for a while, was only $1. Let me see. Other companies like Dollar Tree, they began as other businesses, and the profits from those ventures led to the available capital that helped expand them to the household name they are today. A quick explanation of what I just said. A man named K.R. Perry opened a Ben Franklin's in Norfolk, Virginia back in the 50s. He eventually renames this store and turns it into a five and dime store of his own. This gives way to a toy store, which he calls K&K stores, or excuse me, K&K Toys. During this time, his son Doug Perry and some other guys. There's two other guys. I don't actually remember their names, but the essential men of this timeline are the two Perrys. Doug Perry is creating a franchise called Only $1, which opens in at least three different states: Virginia, Texas, and Georgia. I believe there's a couple others. The toy store that was opened by his father becomes successful during the initial shopping boom. During the initial shopping mall boom of the 60s and 70s, causing them to be bought out by KB Toys in the 90s for a substantial sum. I wasn't actually able to find the amount, but it does look like it was enough money to basically expand the business of his son. Because what they did was they used that money they put that into the Only Dollar stores, and they changed the name from Only Dollar to Dollar Tree in 1983. And 2 years later, they would go public at $15 a share. Laterally, a man by the name of J.L. Turner, who had been buying and selling bankrupt general stores during the Great Depression, which, might I say, is a hell of a profession, he decided to start a store of his own called J.L. Turner and Son in 1939. I wouldn't say that there was much creativity put in that name. Initially, it was a regular goods store that sold things at normal prices until the mid 50s. That's when Turner got the idea to sell products for $1. This came from the idea, or the idea came from him seeing dollar days at the competing dollar stores, or excuse me, at the competing department stores in town and in the area. One day, throughout the year, throughout the season, everything there would be $1, and evidently it was doing really well. And so his mind, the idea being, well, if that works for one day, why wouldn't it work for the other 364? So the first Dollar General was opened in Springfield, Kentucky, in 1955. It sold items for $1. I'd like to make the distinction, as you see, we talked about the businesses that are before the dollar stores, and this is J.L. Turner had a business like that, and so that's why I do make the distinction of him when he first started this business itself. It did start selling items for $1. That's why I feel that is different than Dollar Tree or even Family Dollar. But J.L. Turner would go on to die about 10 years after he started Dollar General. Not long after Turner's death, his son takes the company public, and Dollar General would take the normal ebbs and flows of a growing company. You see them everywhere. It's not as sexy a story as Dollar Tree, but compelling nonetheless, because they chose to begin selling products for $1, even though they changed that model. But other competitors like Dollar Tree didn't start doing that for at least 30 years, because the first only dollar store didn't open until 1986. And prior to that, they were just a toy store. Well-run toy store, but they didn't, the dollar structure was not in their head at all. The story of Family Dollar, which is the third and last dollar store that was researched for this episode, is also not a very sexy story, but it was started in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1959. I mean, I guess I say that people might think their stories are sexy, and my own opinion. But it was started in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1959 by a man named Leon Levine, or Levine, however you pronounce that. He did not keep to the $1 structure for very long, moving up to $2 and $3 and so on to where it is today. The only interesting thing I see that differs, and I find this to be pretty interesting, from the rest of these stories, their creation stories, how they get their inspiration, is that Mr. Levine got his inspiration from visiting a dollar store in Kentucky in 1959. Now, if you remember, J.L. Turner, the creator of Dollar General, had already started his dollar stores in Kentucky 4 years prior. So there's a better than not chance that the man who started Family Dollar got his idea from walking inside a Dollar General, which, I mean, if before this I told you that, you probably wouldn't believe it. I know I wouldn't believe it. It's similar to a man walking into Costco and saying, I'm going to start a Sam's Club. When you think about it, I mean, it really, in the abstract, it's a little too close. I mean, there's no exact proof because all the inspiration really says is he got the idea while being in a dollar store in Kentucky. So you got to put the rest of the pieces together for yourself. But they certainly seem to be there. What unifies these stories is the concept of the discount store, be it five and dime or the almighty dollar. These businesses came into their prime during the middle of the 20th century. Their creation at the time speaks to the transition that society was undergoing from a lot of the well-made goods to the more what I would consider throwaway items. I mean, as stated, Frank Woolworth was not one of the first people, but really kind of pioneered and I would say optimized the idea of taking goods and labor from outside of America where they're cheaply made and bringing them back in and profiting it. Sometimes almost 100% profit in some cases, but not. It's very interesting. Another interesting fact that I found out there's two more, and I'll go ahead and wrap it up. There are two interesting facts that I found out while looking this up. Is that Woolworths, when they started their stores back in the early 1800s, or excuse me, the late 1800s, they were one of the first stores to put their goods out for the customer to inspect before purchase, which is before that, you've seen Westerns or any kind of older movies, you walk into a goods store and there's a man behind the counter and you hand him a list and he gets you whatever you asked for, but that's how it worked, and they basically, they flipped it into what it is now. I mean, can you imagine going into Walmart? Could you imagine the counter that there must have had to, there would have to be if Walmart operated under the old 1850s general store model? So they were one of the first ones to do that. This last one is that Woolworths is basically Foot Locker. I didn't know that. In 1974, Woolworths I'm going to get it down eventually. Woolworths diversified their holdings by purchasing a company called Kenny Shoe Company. They opened stores under this company called Foot Locker. The Woolworth Company incorporated a separate company called the Woolworth Corporation that oversaw the everyday runnings of Foot Locker. And that basically means that the Woolworth started another company under their corporate umbrella, which they could profit from, that in turn became one of the most profitable shoe companies of all time. I mean, so basically from the roots of a five and dime store to basically having kids line up outside of your store for Jordans every Saturday. It's that's a pretty interesting connection, I think. So that's been it. That is the first episode of How Did That Happen. We covered dollar stores, and we've seen how they went from five and dime stores to all the way to Foot Locker, evidently. And so I appreciate you guys for listening in. I hope you guys come back next week. Next week is going to be, I believe it's going to be rubber bands. So we're going to find out what happened with rubber bands. You think it's that simple as rubber and then a band, but it's not. Thanks for listening.